right, so I am so glad you're all here. I think we'll start with our opening comments. So I am Cara Roselle, I'm your host for tonight. I'm the NOFA Mass Education Director, and I also manage our soil health initiatives. Also assisting with hosting tonight is Jocelyn Langer, our incoming NOFA Mass Executive Director. So you are attending the session Beyond Soil Conservation, 21st Century Soil Health Policy Takes Root in the Northeast. And we are with two of my favorite collaborators here in Massachusetts, Keith Zaltzberg and Connor Stedman. We are also really excited to have our special guest presenter tonight, Calla Ostrander, who will give our session some national context. So just to say a little bit more about our presenters, Keith Zaltzberg is a founder and principal environmental designer of the Regenerative Design Group, an ecological landscape architecture and planning firm based in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Keith is the project lead for the Massachusetts Healthy Soils Action Plan, a statewide planning project commissioned by the Massachusetts Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Connor Stedman is principal and lead designer with AppleSeed Permaculture and a farm planner and supply systems educator with Regenerative International. He is lead faculty for the Omega Institute's Ecological Literacy Immersion Program and an affiliate instructor in the University of Vermont's Leadership for Sustainability program. Connor is a technical advisor to the development of carbon farming and soil health policy initiatives in New York State. And Calla Ostrander is an independent consultant who works with individuals and organizations in the regenerative design and agricultural space. Her most recent work has been with People, Food, and Land Foundation, supported by philanthropist Jana King. She has spent the last 6 years as a strategic advisor, communicator, and activist working to scale compost production and the model of regenerative agriculture developed by the Marine Carbon Project across California and the Western United States. She previously worked as a fellow with the Rocky Mountain Institute and spent 10 years developing local climate change policy for the city of Aspen and the city of and County of San Francisco. So, before we jump in, I just have a few details to review with you. So we have a number of sponsors who help make our conference possible. And I encourage you to purchase from them, and when you do so, let them know that you appreciate their support of NOFA. And of course, most importantly, we want to thank you for being here tonight. Thank you so much for attending this first ever virtual conference in our nearly 50-year history of the NOFA Summer Conference. And thank you especially to our NOFA members who make our education and advocacy work possible. Finally, I just want to pause and take a moment to acknowledge that we are presenting, attending, and hosting this workshop from land that was inhabited and managed prior to European colonization. Attendees to this conference will be seeing this slide a lot throughout these weeks that we have together, and I hope that you'll use each opportunity that you see this slide to consider the history of the land that you're living on. Not only to remember the indigenous people who lived there, but also to consider the intervening history that has led to white people who make up just over 60% of the US population owning 98% of rural land. We want to encourage you to use this slide as a reminder of the larger history and systems that our farming, food systems, and gardening practice are rooted in. So this interactive map can be found at the link on the screen, and we'll drop it in the chat as well. So now we can begin our session. I'm so excited to hear from Connor and Calla and Keith. So I'm going to go ahead and hand over to the first presenter. So you can go ahead and start sharing your screen. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful intro, Caro. Howdy, everyone. I'm going to be speaking briefly first here. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go from there. Okay, so this is a panel about policy. And it's a panel about both the existence, the current existence of policy related to climate change and carbon farming and soil health. And it's also about the future potential of where that policy could go. And we really wanted to not neglect one of those two for the other in this conversation. So I'm gonna say a few introductory remarks kind of framing in a big sense what we're talking about today. And then I'm gonna introduce a little more Calla Rose Ostrander, who we're really excited to have with us, and say a little of why we invited her to join this panel as someone who is not from or in the Northeast, and yet I think has some really crucial perspective from her work in the Western US to share with us here. So just thank you so much again, Calla, for being able and willing to join us. And so, you know, I think everyone here is really aware and connected to the fact that climate change is really bad and worsening, and you know, and headed towards some, you know, we're really past the point where the best case scenarios look very good in terms of the global math around greenhouse gases, and we're headed to the point where a lot of the work around climate change mitigation is about attempting to prevent future atrocities. And so the more successful that we are in this decade and generation, the more possible it will be for future generations to live on this planet and to live without genocide and displacement and mass loss of their land and food resources, because that's really what the mainstream climate science is pointing to as an outcome of our current trajectory. So, gosh, that would be great for everyone in the world to be able to tackle and work on and make a big difference around. And so, you know, just to frame a little bit of what this work on climate solutions actually involves and looks like, and if you want to dig into this a lot more, I really encourage people towards two resources. One of them is the work of Project Drawdown, which many of you have likely seen. What's so valuable about Drawdown is it really dispels the idea that there's nothing we can do about climate change, because the way that it articulates the specific both technological and agricultural and social solutions that already exist in every sector of the economy, and then models the effect of adopting and implementing those things worldwide, is really very powerful antidote to feelings of paralysis. It really opens a lot of doorways for people to be involved in climate solutions. That's one of them. And then, but on this policy front, there's a really significant body of work that's been gathered in just the last few years, and it's in the form of a book called Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. And where this book essentially came from was a group of legal scholars and policy people interviewing the climate scientists needed to understand what it would actually take to have, you know, really significant climate policy take root in the U.S. And so that work is kind of in conversation with the development of the Green New Deal and some of the more ambitious kind of national climate policies that are being discussed right now. But to summarize Drawdown and the deep decarbonization pathways work, you know, I think it's really valuable to consider three arenas of climate solutions. So one of them is about emissions reduction. And that's about taking the 10.5 billion tons or so of carbon that we're emitting globally each year into the atmosphere and reducing that number dramatically. This is the rapid decarbonization of whole industries and economies and nations, all the way down to even the footprint of a single, a single company or a single town or a single state. And then there's this whole other part of the equation, right? Because greenhouse gas emissions are a net number between emissions and sequestration. So right now, about 5.5 to 6 billion tons of what's emitted is resequestered into the land and oceans of the planet. And so we want to get that 10.5 billion number to come way down. We want to get that 5.5, 6 billion number to go way up. And that's how we're going to reach the point where the concentration of greenhouse gases is actually going to decrease year over year rather than increasing like it is currently. So these are two different arenas. Some solutions do both. They reduce emissions and they increase land-based sequestration. And then there's a third arena, which is going to be necessary no matter how successful we are at the first two, which is climate adaptation. And that's really interesting because it's possible to see significant results from adaptation to the disrupted climate at a very local level. And the range of how people can participate in climate adaptation in their communities and organizations and companies is really broad. So I just wanted to remember that this whole topic of climate solutions, that what we're talking about today is within, includes all three of these things. And I'm going to come back to this little framework here when talking about the programs in New York State. So I'm going to give you a 2-minute overview of what we're talking about regarding carbon farming and how that's related to soil health. So the work of Dr. Ratan Lal, who was recently awarded a significant World Food Prize for some of the most important research and advocacy around food worldwide. He's out of Ohio State University. Really some of the best research anywhere in the world at understanding what we know and what we don't know about carbon sequestration. And so his and his team's research calculates that this idea of global technical potential. So it's like existing practices we have in a realistic full adoption scenario. So not importantly a 100% conceivable adoption in every conceivable place scenario, but realistic full adoption of existing practices. They model to get us down about 37 parts per million CO2 reduction into agricultural land. And that's in the middle of the range that they calculate. And that's not counting forest management, that's not counting biochar, that's not counting a lot of other technological solutions, but just biosequestration into farmland worldwide. This is the result of their best current research and modeling. So that would be a big deal because we're at 419 parts per million right now, and we sure as heck need to get under 400, and this would get us a lot of the way there, given the trajectory of increase that we're on. So just another view of the deal here in the U.S. Agriculture is responsible for about 9% of all U.S. emissions. U.S. agriculture is responsible for over 1% of all global emissions currently. So right now, agriculture is a net emitter of greenhouse gases, and these numbers are from the UN and the EPA. The widespread realistic adoption of existing conservation practices and simple forms of agroforestry, windbreaks, riparian buffers, things like that, that alone would turn U.S. farming from a net emitter into a net sequesterer. And that's based on some of the work in the Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization book. And the other thing that's clear from the Lal work and Leonard and Rosenberg is that by adding in ag emissions reduction, which I know Calla is going to talk about potentially a little bit in California, the adoption of more intensive use of perennial crops and tree crops in particular, and then just higher end carbon outcome land uses across the board, those things go beyond what these numbers describe. And that means that if we basically really significantly increase the kind of per acre net sequestration, we can go beyond these benchmarks. But this is just talking about with what we've currently got that's in common use, here's what it could look like. Now, all of this is just talking about carbon sequestration. And what's really clear that I know Keith is going to speak a good bit about here is that investing in soil health and the ecological function of farmland is also highly climate adaptive. So depending on what those practices are, floods, droughts, storms, late season freezes, losses of biodiversity can all potentially be mitigated through soil improvements and or landscape improvements. So just for you to picture that a lot of these climate solutions are multifunctional, and that needs to be held in mind when we're talking about them. It's not just one variable, even if carbon might be the one most important variable from a certain point of view. So, okay, and then I want to just frame 3 broad ways to think about policy approaches to carbon farming and soil health. So one way that you could approach addressing this urgent crisis and the potential solutions to it through agriculture, through policy, would be through direct regulation of industries. So this would be like the command and control approach where, for instance, methane emissions from CAFOs are directly regulated, or there's a requirement to use certain practices, or there's a hard cap put on how much pollution a certain industry can emit. Direct regulation is one approach. Another approach, and one that's much more common in agriculture, is the incentivization of practices. So this is where the public sector says, if you do X, we'll support you in Y ways. So often that's in the form of a monetary payment. So the really well-known EQIP program through NRCS is a practice incentivization program. And some of what's being done in California and New York right now involve incentivizing specific practices that have been demonstrated to have some of these climate and environmental outcomes. There are other ways to incentivize practices also through outreach and training and education, but the most direct way to do it is through cash payments. There's a third way to do this, and so most of the conversation has been about direct regulation and or incentivized practices. There's also an approach here which is about incentivizing verified outcomes. And so this is where there's a process to verify and measure the end result of a practice. And so, for instance, that might be, that might be a credit that someone receives for a reduction in nutrient pollution from their farm, or a credit they receive for carbon sequestration. So the idea of actual payments for carbon storage is the incentivization of a verified outcome. These systems are much more complex to set up and maintain because they require the verification and measurement step. So I just wanted to give us this universe because not all of the policy solutions we're talking about are just in one of these categories. Some of them touch on two or even all three. And I wanted us to remember that the topic of carbon farming is bigger than one practice. The topic of carbon farming and soil health policy is bigger than one approach. And part of why we wanted to give you glimpses from 3 different US states right now is to really just grow the picture of what this could look like and potentially even grow our imagination about where these policies could go in the future. So I'm going to give a really quick kind of report on the state of policy and program development in New York State, and then I'm going to introduce Calla. So there are 3 major recent state level initiatives in New York State that are relevant, particularly relevant to this conversation. There's more, and there's things around forestry that we're not going to get into right now. But so one of them is the Climate Resilient Farming Program. So this was established around 2018. It's been funded around $4.5–5 million per year by New York State, which is really a drop in the bucket in a state as large as New York, but it gives you a picture of some seriousness around this. And it is a competitive grant application process, so not dissimilar from the existing EQIP funding through NRCS. And what's interesting about the Climate Resilient Farming Program, I know a number of farmers who've applied for and even received grants for on-farm work through this program, is that it explicitly invites proposals that address emissions reduction, carbon sequestration, and or on-farm climate adaptation. So it's actually interested in all 3 of those arenas of climate solutions on the farm. And so it's unusually kind of broad and flexible in that regard. A fairly large percentage of the program funds have been going to emission reduction mitigation measures on large dairies and through methane emissions reduction efforts in particular. And I think Calla will probably speak more to that on the California side because it's a similar story there. But this is the largest pool of funding that New York State has put into carbon farming and soil health so far. The second one is a soil health initiative. So this is a fairly small program through Cornell University. Its funding is around $200,000 a year. And the main focus is public outreach and collaboration between agencies. One of the things that I've really seen in the New York State process has been the complexity of interagency coordination and the fact that, in the way that our state level agencies and definitely perhaps federal agencies too have been set up, there are agencies who have significant implications for agriculture who are not agricultural agencies and vice versa. And so the Soil Health Initiative is trying to tie some of those things together and have people more aware of what each other are doing. It's sort of an interstitial function that they're playing. And the third one is the Carbon Farming Pilot Program. So this is the one I've been most directly involved in. This is money that was put in the governor's budget to develop a set of pilot demonstration projects of higher outcome carbon farming and soil health practices. So the things that could lead the industry in the future at a range of participating farms that reflect a range of New York State industries in 4 specific counties in the Hudson Valley. So this is being administered through the Dutchess County Soil and Water Conservation District. And it is slowly moving through the agency level process into implementation. There's not a lot of results to report on from this project yet. It was only funded last year for the first time. So I and Sina Hudson and a few other folks wrote a letter to the governor kind of expressing our advocacy around how we thought these funds should be used to have the maximum effect for the development of soil health and carbon farming in New York State. And we'll see to what extent that that is able to influence the way that it's implemented through the conservation district. And they, of course, will have their own thinking about how it should roll out based on their long experience of working with these communities. So, and then there's a fourth one that has been proposed but not passed yet, which I've also worked on, which is a tax credit incentive for carbon sequestration by farms. So that's been proposed. It has been favorably received in the legislature. It has not been passed, and that is called the New York State Carbon Farming Act. So that's the picture in New York State right now. And hopefully that adds some ideas to your minds about kind of what these different policy initiatives can look like, what their relative funding levels might need to be, and what agency level implications they might have. But that's really a good segue here. I'm going to stop my screen share. That's a good segue here into introducing Calla Rose Ostrander a little more, because I met Calla, God, I don't know, years ago at some carbon farming organizing work in California. And, I was really struck by her kind of, by her imagination and entrepreneurial energy that she brought to the project of guiding and influencing policy, and her real attention to relationship building as a pathway towards shaping how a whole state thought about the kinds of policies we're talking about here. And so we were really excited to invite Calla to speak here for two main reasons. One of them is because California's Healthy Soils Initiative, which Calla was intimately involved in developing and moving to the point of actually passing into law. California's Healthy Soils Initiative, both in its level of funding and its source of funding, and in the breadth of what it considers, I would argue is significantly more ambitious than anything that any Northeastern state has attempted so far in this regard. And it is funded through a major piece of climate legislation in California, which is the state cap and trade market. The state cap and trade market generates around $2 billion of revenue for the state of California per year. And there's a percentage of that goes into this Healthy Soils program. But also because Calla has had a really close view of some of the real complexities and challenges of policymaking. And we thought that some of her stories and perspective could help those of us in the Northeast kind of grasp what it's going to take to kind of take on and form and then continue to shape these more ambitious forms of policy moving forward. So I think that's probably a good prompt to turn it over to you, Calla. Anything else you want to introduce yourself with? And then also just what can you tell people about an overview of what the Healthy Soils program is and what it does and what you've learned along the way?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Connor. And I really appreciate the invitation to talk with you all, because this is how things get done, right? It's like that Margaret Mead quote that never doubt that a small group of organized people can change the world, because that's the only thing that really does. So I'm super excited that you all are working on this in the Northeast. Just a couple more things about my background. I don't know if you can see me on your screens, but I am a Waldorf student, so 13 years of Waldorf education. My formal degree is in international political economy, specifically the political economy of environmental policy. So I tend to think both inside the box and outside the box. So that's sort of my range. The other thing I'll just say, just to kind of temper this conversation, is my values align most closely with the progressive movement in the United States. Politically, I'm a pragmatist. So that's kind of what it comes down to for me in terms of how I have operated in the past. So the Healthy Soils Initiative in California, again, I don't know if you guys can see me because I'm only seeing a black screen, but I'm going to keep talking. So
we can see you, Calla. You're good.
Okay, great. The Healthy Soils in California initiative came about from a lot of different players cooperating to make it happen. And there are a couple of pieces there that I'll go into in a minute, but as a general overview, as Connor said, it is linked to the state's cap and trade program. And because of that, we really had to make sure that it included carbon sequestration in that program. And so, because in order to receive funds from California's cap and trade program, you had to have a demonstrable carbon reduction associated with it. That has now changed, and that fund is opening up, which poses a whole new set of challenges for us. But when we were developing the program, we needed to be able to prove carbon sequestration for that program. So the program, the success of it relied on a lot of key pieces, one of which is science. Another one is really good alliances, and then political will in order to make this happen. And some of that political will was generated by market dynamics, which I'll get into. But last year, the last round of allocation, we had $28 million in the state of California's Healthy Soils program. As Connor mentioned, it's an incentive-based program. It pays for a certain suite of practices that are modeled closely on the suite of practices that are approved by the USDA and NRCS as soil conservation practices. Both the Healthy Soils program and the USDA and NRCS share a common tool, which we also help develop as part of the program, which is the COMET tool or COMET Planner. That tool was actually really important in this process because we needed a way, like I said, to show carbon sequestration. So the Healthy Soils program, $28 million last round, incentives for farmers and ranchers, and practice-based incentives modeled off of the COMET program. Now, we did modify that COMET tool, which is a modeling tool, to be parameterized specifically for California crops and to include compost as a practice, which makes it a little different than the national tool, but it is a shared tool. So then there's a couple of other things that I think are important to understand about this. One is that there's also kind of, I would propose a fourth category to what Connor mentioned as you have direct regulation, incentives for practices, incentives for value-based outcomes or verified outcomes. And I would say that as you think about policy in the Northeast, also think about the fact that there may be an adjacent policy that moves the market or moves political constituents that you need to move in order to transition. For us in California, that adjacent policy was compost. Because it's a very dry state, because we have really low soil organic matter, we have low rainfall, one of the fastest ways to build soil organic matter in California and in a lot of the dry regions which I work is compost application, not only on rangelands, as was demonstrated by the Marin Carbon Project, but also on croplands and in orchard settings. So we were simultaneously, in addition to supporting the development of the Healthy Soils Initiative, we supported the development of about 4 different policies that created a new market space around compost products. So pushing organics out of landfills, pushing manure out of slurry ponds, prohibiting I guess I would say like high emissions use of those organic materials. And that accumulated in a first of its kind climate bill, Senate Bill 1383, which regulated short-lived climate pollutants. So this is what I would call an adjacent bill. That bill, that piece of policy was about short-lived climate pollutants, so it was targeting methane. But what it did was it essentially sort of brought California's agricultural system, which would previously not been included in the cap and trade program, under that system in a way, by regulating methane, as well as bringing landfills into that system and cities, right? So we kind of were able to bring in all of these actors to participate by talking about the fact that the Healthy Soils Initiative would create incentives for compost. And that means, in common language, we would talk about, that's markets. So for folks like the dairy industry that were looking for new markets for products from their waste, that was a reason for them to sort of get on board. For folks like zero waste advocates who are trying to get organics out of landfills, reduce methane from landfills, that was a reason to get on board. So the waste hauling industry, the compost industry, and traditional ag, while they weren't necessarily core supporters of the Healthy Soils Initiative to begin with, although I would say the compost industry is now, we were able to work on an adjacent set of policies that supported the overall program development, because healthy soils was then seen in some ways as market creation for this value add product for these industries. And of course, compost is not the only soil health practice. We absolutely know that, but it is one that farmers really like. So it was a really easy place to start. If you look at the incentives in California, the most requested practice within the Healthy Soils program is for compost. It's the single most requested practice for funding from farmers and ranchers, because it has those immediate nutrient benefits, water holding benefits, and other things that come along with it. So people see in a more immediate a benefit for it. Now, riparian restoration, tree planting, these are really good things in the long run, but they don't have that short-term benefit that the farmer really sees. So again, by focusing on compost, we were able to create an adjacent set of stakeholders that enabled the political will to support the development of the Healthy Soils program. I really also have to credit the core supporters of the Healthy Soils program, California Alliance for Family Farmers, CAF, CalCan, which is the Climate Agricultural Network, Carbon Cycle Institute, and many others that came together to support this initiative. So, you know, we did work a lot with the traditional organic small farmers as the basis for that Healthy Soils program, as well as the conservation districts. They're a really core player. Now, they're not a political player, but they're a core player in terms of education and how we're going to do this. So again, we have the Healthy Soils Initiative, a bunch of funding over here, but we also have simultaneously the composting and organics management programs over here. And within the ecosystem of California's political economy surrounding agriculture, those two things together were able to create the shift to get us to where we are today. The other thing I'd mention is that by bringing in compost, we were able to bring in cities to support healthy soils and a lot of the agricultural sort of work on the emissions reduction side for methane. Now that sounds strange, you know, what would cities have to do with slurry ponds? Well, they don't, but they do have a lot of organic materials, and cities are strong voices, and so having them be supportive to the state for this type of legislation process was also helpful. The final thing I'll mention here, and I'll just be brief because I want to open it up for people's questions at the end, is that John Wick, who was the co-founder of the Marin Carbon Project, actually hired a lobbying firm for 3 years to support development of these policies. We shared that firm for several years with the Carbon Cycle Institute, and then we coordinated with many other lobbyists and activists in Sacramento. So, you know, oftentimes we think about policy as being sort of wonky. What John Wick did that was different was he actually hired a lobbying firm out the gate, and then having a team of lobbyists on the ground in Sacramento, coordinating and building coalitions, talking to everybody, you know, getting all the exact details right, really was a game changer. And I don't think that we could have done it without those lobbying presences. CalCan also had a really active lobbyist in that space, as well as now we see lobbyists from the Nature Conservancy and NRDC engaging in this, but it was very unconventional for an individual to hire a lobbying team. I led strategy for that lobbying team. I didn't do the lobbying myself, but I just want to kind of be realistic about the fact that if you really want to get something big passed that's going to have a lot of money around it, you are going to really want to secure some form of lobbyist to represent that interest and keep you informed, and be there on the ground every day to work through these issues. So I guess one quick update, due to COVID and due to the opening up of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to non-carbon based projects, we have actually seen the Healthy Soils program be defunded for next year. Now that's not a final thing, but we're not seeing money in the budget for that. So we are looking at other sources of revenue and raising other sources of revenue to fund these programs at a much more substantial level. We believe that if we could get $100 million into that program every year for 10 years, that the agricultural sector could achieve carbon neutrality in California by 2030. So I'll just leave you with that. And if you're interested in hearing about how we came up with those estimates for the 2030 process. There are about 14 organizations involved in that. And then there's a separate group that's working on how we're going to fund revenue for that. Maybe it's bonds, maybe it'll be a new tax. I'm happy to talk about that as well. But for now, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Calla. That's just really valuable story to just have a little bit of contact with from your experience. And you know, if people are interested, I can also speak some to what the lobbying and kind of strategy development side has looked like in New York, because it's a little different than what you pointed to, but there are some significant parallels as well. So I think we'll turn it over to Keith here to, you know, to kind of go from, you know, a project in its nascency, programs in their nascency in New York, so, some somewhat more developed programs that have been going for a few years in California that are a bit more ambitious, that a lot has been learned from, and then this almost even earlier stage process, but involving a lot of research and strategy development in Massachusetts. So let's turn it over to you, Keith, and you're going to share your screen with slides as well.
Well, Calla and Connor, thanks so much for setting the stage there. And I was really interested to hear Calla describe the sort of three-legged stool of building policy, relying on the really building of alliances, grounding everything in science, and then generating and building political will to act. And I think I've been seeing a similar set of needs here in Massachusetts as we pivot from this sort of study phase of the Massachusetts Healthy Soils Action Plan toward drafting recommendations for goals, strategies, and actions that eventually will make their way into policy. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and let's make sure that it works. Can everybody hear me, actually?
See some nods and some thumbs up.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, well, here we go with a screen share. And so in 2019, we were awarded a contract to help the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, excuse me, develop an action plan to protect and enhance all soils across the state in order to support healthy ecosystems and the economic and other activities of people within the state. The idea there is that this would be developed through improved policies and programs that would then support more strategic ideas about how to protect and use land, and giving land managers the tools, the educational access, and the incentives to manage land better, particularly soils better, and also identify some key research needs. And we were really lucky to be able to pull together a really strong team that includes NOFA Mass. Caro and I have worked with Marty Dagoberto, the policy director, as well as a consulting firm, Linnaean Solutions, which does a lot of climate policy work, and Eric Tonsmeyer, who was one of the authors for land-based solutions from Project Drawdown that Connor mentioned, and another really wonderful book called The Carbon Farming Solution. So together with my team at Regenerative Design Group, we've been working on developing the scientific understanding of the current conditions of soils in Massachusetts, and starting to point towards things that could improve the outcomes for soils. This has been grounded in this kind of four-part process that has relied really heavily on engagement and alliance, or the first steps towards alliance building. So we've talked with a lot of different land practitioners, and we have about 40 different folks from different agencies and large nonprofits in Massachusetts and across the Northeast who are providing really detailed information and guidance on soil dynamics as well as practices and how they are related. That is supported by an in-depth global literature review with a focus on regional materials about a number of different factors and functions that contribute to the way soils work. We've also spent an awful lot of time mapping and analyzing the way land covers and soil types and drainage classification interact through the use of mapping software. And after a fairly short foray into this work, we realized we needed to understand more deeply what the soil organic carbon stocks and potential fluxes were for the state of Massachusetts, because one of the main drivers of this is Massachusetts' piece of legislation that's called the Global Warming Solutions Act, in which the state committed to reducing its emissions to net zero by 2050. In order to get there, they have to deal with the kinds of emissions reductions that Connor and Calla were talking about, as well as increasing carbon sequestration of natural and managed lands, and then working toward improved management of land in a climate change scenario through adaptation. And because land-based emissions in Massachusetts account for about 15% of the total budget of carbon in the state, they're hoping that the lands and the soils that underlie them and ecosystems that grow on top of them can help pull down 15% or more of that soil organic carbon. So after this 16 months, I guess, that it's been since we started working on this in March of 2019, we've developed 6 broad goals for soil health in Massachusetts that, again, will need to be shaped and grounded through more engagement in order to become policies that support meaningful change. But the number one goal that we have in Massachusetts is limiting the conversion of natural and working lands to developed conditions, meaning impervious surfaces that underlie our towns and cities, and the supporting landscapes that surround them, like turf and ornamental gardens. The next biggest goal that we have for the state is to transform the way soils are managed and the way specifications are written for the development processes when you do transform land from forest, farms, or other natural landscapes into these more urbanized conditions. And that's because of the density of population that we have in Massachusetts and the distribution of it. That is another very high leverage thing. In order to support better land management, the third goal is really focused on increasing people's knowledge about how soil systems work. The agriculture sector is farthest along in terms of understanding how to manage for soil health. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, several of the other sectors have not even really considered this as part of their charge. So making sure people have the information and incentives that they need to do that, and then making sure that our soil health is built into all of the performance standards and management standards on public lands, and that they're aligned with all adjacent policies. For instance, the Wetland Protection Act will have an enormous influence on the way soil health functions in the coming 40 years in Massachusetts. And then sort of in the command and control realm, requiring that people that are managing land as professionals have certifications and trainings that are appropriate to managing the soil health within their sector. And then if we're to really understand how we're doing in managing the health of the soils, we need to be able to measure and analyze our soils better, and making sure that we have adequate expertise and equipment within the state is one way that we can enhance that. So these are the big picture goals, and I'm going to dig into, that's been a great pun, by the way, that we've joked about a lot in these days. But we're going to dig into how we got there, because this is going to have major potential impact on how all people across the state manage land, and how they are impacted by various policies. It has to be grounded in a really clear understanding of what soil health is and how we measure it and how we then go about building or diminishing it. So the NRCS for the last 100 years has been thinking a lot about how do we keep soils in place. And over the last 10 years, they've turned their attention to understanding soil health as this multifunctional set of interactions that go about supporting healthy ecosystems and the products that they yield. So the four major types of ecosystem functions that we're talking about when we're talking about soil health in Massachusetts is the ability of soil to hold and store carbon, which influences other dynamic properties of the soil, including how water functions on a given parcel of land, on a certain block of soil. So water performance is another key thing. How does the soil itself function as a biological entity? What kind of diversity does it have? And how well are those organisms working together to support the overall productive capacity from an ecological and an economic standpoint in our soils? So it turns out that soil organic carbon, although it's hard to measure, people argue about the various modeling that you might use and how the testing demonstrates the reality. It's one of the few universally understood measures of soil health. And so we've relied heavily on soil organic carbon, as well as on water capacity and stormwater management in this project. And those dynamic functions of soil are strongly influenced by historic and current land use, as well as the land cover, meaning what is growing on top of that land. So in Massachusetts, we understood that we're very different than New York State and California in that we have very little farmland, and we have an awful lot of forest relative to our size. So more than 58% of the state, 5 million acres of Massachusetts, is covered in some form of tree canopy. And the breakdown of forests versus trees is something we looked into, which is interesting but not relevant here. Comparatively, we have about 1/10 of the state covered in wetlands. And while we often don't think of wetlands as a land type that's managed, because of Massachusetts' history as a cranberry producing state and a place where a lot of development is happening, it turns out we're either actively or passively managing an awful lot of our wetlands in Massachusetts, even though we don't actually know very much about management of wetlands from a soil health perspective. Agriculture, depending on how you measure it, occupies about 4% of Massachusetts. And if you count all of the forests associated with farms, then you basically double the acreage that you're looking at to over 500,000 acres in Massachusetts. But you can see when you look at this that the farmland is not distributed equally, and that we have an interesting concentration of it in the Connecticut River Valley, unsurprisingly, and more in the sort of Worcester Plateau. Turf and ornamental landscapes, by contrast, occupied way more of the landscape in Massachusetts than anybody really had understood before 2016, when we were able to use a combination of remote sensing technologies to measure the land cover on every square meter of the state. And so it turns out that in Massachusetts, we have almost 500,000 acres in turf and ornamental landscapes. More, almost twice what we have in agriculture. And we do, in fact, also have almost 500,000 acres, almost 1/10 of the state covered in impervious surfaces, roads, buildings, and other types of non-permeable surfaces. And that's important because that not only dramatically affects watershed health as water concentrates more quickly, it also impacts the soil that's below that. And it's generally understood that once you cover soil in impervious surface, it's kind of mummified for the long term. So together, these 5 land types break down something like this. And while there are others, the forests, wetlands, agriculture, turf and landscaped areas, and impervious are the 5 land types that we focused on as places where we can strongly influence soil practice in a way that has significant outcomes for the state. So if we just look at those 5 different land types and ask the question, where does carbon live in Massachusetts? There's a resounding answer of it lives in our wetlands. On an acre by acre standpoint, you can see that the carbon density of soil organic carbon is dramatically higher than even in our forested landscapes, which again, this surprised everyone who wasn't deeply familiar with this, but I think it points to some really interesting directions around distinctions rather between measuring for soil carbon and using that as a sole indicator of soil health versus using a multiple functions as measures of soil health. Because in this case, it would say, well, we should focus all of our soil health on wetlands. When we look at in total where soil organic carbon lives in Massachusetts, you can see that it's wetlands still possess the most, but forests are a close second, whereas turf and impervious still have more carbon than our agriculture. And, you know, as at the NOFA Summer Conference, the 200 plus, we're interested in agriculture, and so the 200,000 plus acres are containing about 45 tons per acre of soil organic carbon in the typical soils under typical management in Massachusetts. That includes hay, pasture, and cultivated lands, and there's a wide range between those two. Some really well-managed pasture lands can have quite a bit more than this, and most cultivated lands have substantially less than this. Forests and trees, on the other hand, they hold more soil carbon, but they also, as a whole ecosystem, have 10 times or more carbon than what we see in agriculture. Wetlands, interestingly, as we said before, are extraordinarily high, whereas turf and ornamental landscapes, depending on how you measure it, and depending on where trees are or are not, you end up with about 40 tons per acre, which is, you know, a little less than twice what you see in developed and impervious surfaces. But I think big picture in Massachusetts, when you look at the current land types that we have and the trajectory for change, the difference between developed lands and forest lands is really what we need to be thinking about. So because we have three major threats to soil health in Massachusetts, they include land conversion, how lands are actively managed, and then climate change and natural hazards. So without a doubt, conversion of farms and forests and other open space to low density development in particular is the greatest threat we're seeing in Massachusetts. This kind of highly fragmenting land type not only requires a lot of roads, but the processes by which we arrive at this kind of landscape is very bad for our soils. And if we project forward where and to what extent lands might get developed, it varies quite widely in Massachusetts. We've looked at this one source of data which created 5 different models called the New England Land Futures Project. It's out of Harvard Forest. And in their most extreme model, they're showing over 800,000 acres of potential conversion from natural and working lands toward developed lands. And if you take all of their 5 models and look for consistency between them, you'll see that there are almost 400,000 acres of land that are at higher risk of development. If you aggregate these by watershed, you start seeing some very interesting patterns. For instance, if you look down here on the south coast and in the southeast region, you have extraordinarily high development pressure. And if you could remember, this is also an area of very high wetland concentration. So the impact of development in these places could potentially be very bad from a carbon standpoint, a water quality standpoint, and generally soil health. So if we think about what kind of land is likely to be converted, we see the majority of the land, according to these different models, is likely to land in forest. That's in part because it's most abundant and often the least protected. However, the recent trends, which is one of their models, which looks at kind of just what happened over the last 20 years and projects that same pattern forward, shows 12,000 acres of soil organic carbon loss, and at over 300 tons per acre, that's an awful lot of carbon that would be lost with 12,000 acres of wetlands. And we see much of that being converted to turf and impervious, and a very small loss of agriculture, which I don't actually believe, because we've lost over 11,000 acres of agriculture in the last 15 years. So it's very likely that this model just undercounts the amount of agricultural change. But we modeled a few different change scenarios of our own, which were pretty simplistic, basically saying, okay, well, if you take all of that land conversion that you see and estimate it, here's what you're likely to see in terms of soil organic carbon flux. You're going to lose quite a lot of soil organic carbon. If you reduce that somewhat by better planning and improving best management practices in different scenarios, then you can avoid some losses and you can increase carbon sequestration. But you'll see that our biggest losses under all scenarios are from forests, whereas we're gaining more from in these different land types that are more related to development. Now, land management is where you see the next biggest impact, and there's 4 general management principles that have been developed by the NRCS and are sort of widely adopted, or are widely adopted as sort of practical ways of thinking about soil health in agricultural settings that are pretty transferable to these other settings. So minimizing disturbance, maximizing living cover, making sure that you have good biodiversity within the soil and in the ecosystem on top of that soil, and maximizing the presence of living roots for as much of the year as possible. And it turns out, if we look at some of the technical potential of best management practices, specifically in Massachusetts, taking an approach similar to that of LAL that Connor was describing, you see that there are two real standouts here. It's the restoration of peatlands, which have previously been converted primarily to cranberry bogs, and the restoration of freshwater wetlands in areas that have been otherwise developed or degraded. Now, when we look at best management practices under these different scenarios, because of the feasibility of avoiding losses of development and getting people to adopt these management practices more thoroughly, you can actually see that the biggest impact is improving the way turf is managed in Massachusetts. And that's been a surprise to a lot of us. But it's very important because we're going to need to be adapting to many of the climate impacts, which include greater intensity and frequency of big storms, which are going to create more stormwater problems, including flooding, which can lead to massive erosion and increased drought. And increasing the amount of soil organic carbon is a multi-benefit solution, like Connor was talking about, that increases the performance of stormwater and resilience to drought. And that's important because, as you see from the soil plume entering the Long Island Sound during Hurricane Irene, you can lose hundreds of billions of pounds of soil each year under a single event. And in this state of Massachusetts, if you look at the lands that are most subject to flooding, while agriculture is strongly present in the floodplain of our rivers, developed open space, meaning turf and other kind of garden landscapes, and impervious surfaces and buildings are very present as well. And so there's not a lot you can do to improve soil health and soil performance in these already impervious landscapes, but by increasing the health and the carbon content of developed open space and agricultural lands, you can have some positive impact on these impervious lands as well.
Hey, Keith.
So, yeah, Connor.
Sorry to jump in. It looks like Calla has to go in about 10 minutes here on her schedule. So I just wanted to make sure that people had a chance to ask her a few questions. Very, very sorry to interrupt, but just want to watch our time.
That's fine. I was just wrapping up here. So, all of that background was provided the basis for those 6 proposed goals that I mentioned before, which really focus on limiting conversion of natural working lands and enhancing the way we're managing our developed lands and continuing to support the kind of great conservation work that's been done in the agricultural sector in Massachusetts and making sure that every farm and every forest is using best management practices. So I will pause there and on this sort of high-level strategies for soil health across land types. Turn it over back to the team. I guess I just want to mention that, so we're developing these sort of broad strategies, which will then be supported by specific recommended actions that can be taken, which include a whole bunch of amendments to the Wetlands Protection Act, changes to the Massachusetts Building Code to include a post-construction soil performance standard, and and or local bylaws to support that kind of stuff, and a hard look at the way organic waste is managed in Massachusetts, and where, for instance, because we don't have an enormous amount of agricultural land, and there's a fair amount of controversy about whether or not compost is good for lawns or not, one question that we have is, where can you put all of the compost that the Department of Environmental Protection is encouraging people to generate and divert from the waste stream? One thing to note also is that NOFA has sponsored a Healthy Soils bill, which would help establish some pilot funding for programs related to soil health improvement in Massachusetts. And so that's one piece of policy that's actually got legs that Marty DiGoberto, the policy director, has done an awful lot of work on. Before COVID was likely to sort of see it through this year, but we'll see what happens in the coming year. So thanks for your attention, and back to you, Connor.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Keith, for that really wide and detailed look at this research and analysis that you all have been doing. Yeah, just knowing that Calla has to jump in a few minutes here, I just want to prioritize people who may have questions for Calla before she has to go. I see one in the chat that I'll just read out, Calla, which is, someone says, more about the benefits of lobbyists over private citizens.
Okay, well, it's a both and situation. It's not an either or. I think that we did what we did because we had both. We had folks on the ground in places as far away as Humboldt, organizing citizens to Los Angeles, to San Diego, which is traditionally a conservative county. We were very targeted in having influential legislators from both parties hear from on-ground citizenry. Kiss the Ground played a great role in this in terms of providing education and advocacy with their networks. We're seeing more of that private citizen movement and support for that from NRDC these days, and Kiss the Ground continues to play a great role in that. You know, individual private citizens, I think, are really what makes it work, and the combination of being able to have a lobbyist who could say, like, look, we really need to get this legislator on board, and finding the farmers, the citizens, the advocates in that legislative district and talking to them and getting them to call that person, you know, that really is what made it work. And I think what we see with corporations, it's just lobbyists. And a lot of times with environmental movements, it's just the same NGOs and the citizen lobbyists. And when we got, you know, a private lobbyist and citizens to line up on their messaging, that's when we really built a lot of political will, you know, in combination with everything that CalCan had done, and that we had spent years building strong networks of farmers who were willing to have legislators come on their property and tours. I can't overemphasize the importance of tours, whether it's for forestry or wetlands or rangelands, inviting people onto farms in their districts, showing them what this looks like in those landscapes. You know, that's a massive piece of this. So I don't think it's lobbyists over citizens. I think it's lobbyists and citizens and farmers and ranchers who are willing to communicate and demonstrate what they're doing to their elected officials.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Great.
We have another question in the comments for you, Calla. Was vermicomposting included in the composting programs and funding?
Yeah, so the way we did the legislation around composting was actually to focus on organic materials management. And so rather than dictating that it needed to all go towards compost, we said it can't go towards high emission management practices like landfills or incineration or you know, open water slurry ponds or water management systems for manure. So you know, that was a compromise we had to make in order to get the biodigestion industry on board. I don't necessarily like biodigesters for farms. They can work in some situations. They can be big causes of continuing environmental justice issues in other situations. But that's a long way of saying vermicompost could benefit from the same incentives that came about because of the organics legislation, but we didn't specify vermicompost. What we did was we managed for organic materials or organic waste. We could cover a broad range of forestry, agriculture, and municipal products or materials that could be turned into a variety of products, whether that's vermicompost, standard compost, in some cases biochar or mulch. So we wanted to really open up that marketplace for a variety of products.
Great. So I had one question for you, and then I think what I'll do is invite folks to, because I haven't seen any more questions come in on the chat, I'll invite folks to come off of mute to ask you questions, but I did want to just use my host privilege to put in a question from me. Which is that I was wondering if you have seen any resistance from farmers in participating in incentives programs that are funded by cap and trade because of the sort of philosophical objection to participating in a program that's sort of funded by ongoing pollution. That's something we're grappling a bit with here in the Northeast, and I'm wondering how that has worked out in your programs.
Well, it's interesting. So I'm hearing a couple different possible questions within that. Money is money for farmers. So I definitely don't think that, and for farmers in California and ranchers in California, California has a lot of agricultural land and it has even more rangelands. And I've never met a rancher or farmer who didn't want compost and wouldn't take money for compost. The issue that we ran into was how complicated the application program was. It was really way too complicated, took up too much time. And it was the first year they hosted it, they had it out in harvest season. So that was a problem, right? Don't put out a grant application in the middle of harvest season. That's a good lesson. We didn't run into any philosophical challenges. What I do see is that farmers are more interested in voluntary carbon markets. They're more conservative in their kind of political leanings. And so something that sounds like a market-based solution instead of a government subsidy, even if it's like the same thing, is going to be more palatable for a lot of conservative farmers. At the same time, some farmers don't ever want to let the NRCS on their property. They're probably not going to apply to the Healthy Soils program. So I think, we didn't really see that. The other piece of it, I think, is this sort of, there's a little bit of an aspect of an environmental justice question in that, and we have a very strong environmental justice community in California, and for them, carbon offsets are not an option because it perpetuates a system of dominance that is based on extraction someplace and people in that place where the extraction is happening suffering and continuing to suffer. So I saw a lot more opposition for carbon offsets from the environmental justice community, and well as opposition from dairy digesters in the environmental justice community. And again, that has to do with the historical damage that dairy as an industry and agriculture as an industry has caused in those communities. So I think you do have to be sensitive to what are the politics and what are the environmental considerations and health considerations of the communities on the ground, whether that's the farmers or the workers or the communities who live around them. And that can be a balancing act. And frankly, it's not always perfect. Sometimes I had to make considerations to work with the dairy lobby, and then now I've been working against them for 3 years. So, it's a balancing act. And I think one of the things we have to be careful of is not to let the perfect be the enemy of good.
Great. Thank you so much. It sounds like you have to go, so we won't hold you any longer. We'll let Connor and Keith finish up our Q&A here. Really appreciate your time, Calla, and it's lovely to meet you in this way. I hope to cross paths with you again. So thank you so much for your time and for being here.
Thank you guys for all the work you're doing. It's really, really great to see it. And just a plug for the people who on the call might not know about it, there's something called the Soil Health Policy Map. It's on a website called Nerds for Earth. And I built it with that group. It lists out all the existing soil health policies or related soil health policies in the US, state by state, and it breaks down how each of those policies are structured, the definitions within those policies, for those of you who don't know about it, it's a good place to start to familiarize yourself with the diversity of them. And I would just say, Keith, you did a great presentation really showing on what you're managing for in Massachusetts and how to really look at your landscapes and what they need. And again, you know, like who the industries are involved in your area. So keep up that work, keep thinking innovatively and outside the box. And good luck, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Calla.
Thanks so much, Calla. Great to meet you.
All right. Keith, did you want to go ahead and, there's a question for you here. Did you want to go ahead and answer this question, or did you want to just wrap up your last few slides? I think we have probably a little time to squeeze that in if you'd like to. It's up to you.
No, I think I'm good. I think I've covered most of it. Yeah.
So there's a long question here. I'm going to do my best. So are you also working with forest ecology, wetland, sorry, there's a truck going by, wetland, biodiversity, and ecosystems experts to help understand big picture and update informed management practices for policy? I didn't hear those named initially. I'd like to see different sectors collaborating more holistically. For example, our activist group has been working with allies like Save Mass Forests on forest protection on Massachusetts public lands, but don't see all players in land use at the table.
Yeah, I mean, this is an important question and points out some important dynamics that exist in any endeavor, whether that is a state-led endeavor like this one or more of a grassroots. And that's getting the right people in the same place or virtually talking about the right topics. And we have been incredibly fortunate to have a remarkable amount of engagement from people in the nonprofit sector, like the American Farmland Trust, NOFA, of course, Mass Audubon, and the Nature Conservancy, who have a strong grounding in policy and advocacy for ecological and agricultural change. And we've also had an additional about 40 people from various departments and agencies within the state, ranging from the Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Environmental Restoration, Department of Conservation of Resources, the NRCS itself, and a number, many others, to help give us the fullest picture we can about how soil impacts different ecosystems and how the management of those different ecosystems affects soil over time. So, of course, we missed people, and I'm sorry for that. And I think we did get a really excellent representation. We will be holding next Wednesday, the 29th, we'll be holding 3 different listening sessions, which will give a more in-depth, if you can believe it, review of the work we've done and a lot more time for people to comment on the recommendations and actions for the Healthy Soils Action Plan. And you can find information about that on the website of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, who's the sponsor of this project.
Just to know that we've also created a public Facebook event for that on the NOFA Mass Facebook page, so you can find it there as well. And I saw it's on your website, Regenerative Design Group's page. So awesome. So let's see. I have one question for you, Keith, and then after that, I think we'll open it up for folks to come off mute to ask their questions until 6:30. So one question I had for you is, when you were talking about some of your pathways for change, you mentioned potentially requiring soil health certifications and trainings for land-based professionals. I was wondering if you could give a couple of examples of what those soil health certifications and trainings might look like.
Oh, sure. Well, you know, we're fortunate to be able to stand on the shoulders of some organizations and states that have already done some really deep thinking about this. And the state of Maryland, because of its position in the Chesapeake Bay has been a real innovator in cross-land type thinking. And so they recognized the impact that turf grass management was having on water quality in the Chesapeake Bay and passed some legislation to require that all professional lawn care and turf companies have continuing education, and that their operators are certified in the application of fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and I think we could model a more holistic program for turf, for instance, around that kind of approach, where it's focused on improving the education for people who are actually out there in the field. Now, in Massachusetts, it's also interesting because 60+% of all turf grass is owned by private homeowners, essentially. And so there's been some other proposed policy change or regulations, like a fertilizer tax, for instance, that would be applied to every bag of fertilizer sold, and then that money could go in to fund education programs or environmental quality programs.
Great, thank you. I think, Connor, you were going to tackle this next question from Patrick. Do you mind just sort of stating the question before you answer it?
Yeah, for sure. So the question is, in the Northeast, REGI, the greenhouse gas initiative, has been highly effective at reducing greenhouse gases from power plants specifically, but they have a way to measure the emissions at the point of pollution. So the question is, do we need a soil carbon measurement system to accelerate incentivization of soil carbon sequestration? Yeah, I think so, and I think I would frame it a little differently than that, which is that, you know, there's a body of empirical research about soil carbon sequestration, and that research contains some things we're confident in and some things we're less confident in. So, for instance, on the side of the things, on the side of things we're more confident in, soil organic carbon is pretty well correlated with kind of total carbon in the upper horizons of soil. On the other hand, there are soil mineral carbon compounds in the lower horizons of soil that we know almost nothing about. They may constitute as much as a third of all soil carbon stocks, and we have essentially no good research-based information about how, if at all, above ground management affects them at all. And so the ability to directly incentivize an environmental outcome does depend on the ability to measure that outcome. And so the accurate measurement, accuracy is one variable in the soil carbon measurement system you're talking about, and another one is precision, and another one is affordability and accessibility, right? So a kind of widespread protocol for how soil carbon is measured as a means to incentivize its storage is going to have to achieve accuracy and precision and affordability and accessibility. And there are a number of initiatives that are moving in that direction that haven't quite arrived at that point yet. So, I want to point to the work that Caro has done, actually, on taking the 300-page NRCS soil health handbook and condensing it into something actually readable, and then creating a set of physical measurement tools that fit in a little box that you can carry with you and don't require a soil sample submission to a lab. That's a very good kind of rapid field assessment of soil health, but it's not and it doesn't achieve the accuracy or precision of a soil carbon measurement. And so for a soil carbon measurement, in terms of like rapid in-field results, that would depend on the development of either one of several things. So at Yale, Yale School of Forestry is developing a tool called Yale Quick Carbon, which is a machine that is a little portable infrared sensor, and it reads the amount of carbon in a soil sample within minutes when you enter a sample into the machine. They're not widely available yet. They're not on the market. It's a technology in development, but that would be a huge advance in our ability. But then modeling would be required. You know, we were talking about modeling earlier. Modeling would be required to know how well correlated is that infrared measurement to the actual soil carbon stock, and what would the design need to be of the sampling approach to be able to know that you were getting the level of accuracy and precision that you'd need to get. That's one initiative that's working on that. Another one is there's a company in the Midwest who's developed a portable piece of technology that you carry into the field with you, and you get the basic soil chemical test results back within 45 minutes out of the technology. So that's NPK, organic matter, pH, things like that. However, again, it's only calibrated through modeling to soils in Minnesota and the Dakotas currently. So, so that's one version of it. Another version of it is lab sampling that then is enough modeling is done that you can take a smaller number of samples at appropriate places and have them well correlated to what this means for soil organic stocks. And that may then be cross-referenced with, you know, remote imagery through drones, or more likely satellite, because that reduces the cost significantly. So that's the work that the Open Team initiative is working on out of Wolf's Neck Farm in Maine, and they're working with folks at Woods Hole and other places in developing the software platform and the kind of data management platform that would enable that. This is all a very geeky answer to a very straightforward question, but the point is a bunch of people are working on it and it's not quite there yet. And it would be quite important to be able to directly incentivize that carbon outcome.
It's a great, very comprehensive answer, Connor, but amazingly, knowing a little bit about this stuff, I know that it's only just scratching the surface too, so it's just a very active space. We had another question about, can we do aerial carbon analysis? That could be for either of you. I know that there's sort of a couple of things that can mean, so maybe you can unpack that a bit. And I think that might be the last question we have time for tonight. Do
you want to take that, Keith, or?
I actually, yes, and I want to add to it. NASA launched a satellite in September last year that would be doing some surveys of landscape scale carbon, and it's currently being calibrated, and you know they're working with some states to try to figure out how above ground carbon correlates with below ground carbon. Turns out it doesn't super duper correlate with that, so it's a hard thing. And I will say that while this conversation and all the testing of carbon is essential for us to be talking about right now, it doesn't need to tie our hands on anything. It does on some of the political realm on this like pay for performance incentives, but Comet Planner and other programs are able to identify benefit from practices which probably increase soil organic carbon. And it's important to remember too that soil organic carbon isn't the only thing that matters. Someone asked a great question of like, because farms don't have very much carbon in Massachusetts and because it's such a small amount, should we change our focus to wetlands and forests? But there is great benefit that can be achieved on even small farms to water quality, stormwater performance, quality of life, which don't forget about that, as well as to pollinator habitat and other habitat dynamics by employing a lot of the soil health practices that the NRCS and other groups like NOFA have spent a lot of time understanding and developing. And so I would encourage people to not wait until we know and just do things that we think are building soil health, but continue approaching it with an open mind and asking the hard questions.
That's a great point to go out on, Keith. Thank you so much for that. Yes, we cannot wait until we know more to act. So great. This is a really wonderful session. I just want to thank both of you so much for your time. I know how incredibly busy you are, and this has been a phenomenal session getting folks caught up in what's happening in soil health policy. I did just want to say that we have a tweener, sort of between session live music event happening if you'd like to tune into that while you are waiting for the next session to start. So I dropped a link to that session into the chat, and it should be available in the program book. Connor and Keith, thank you so much again. It's been really lovely to spend this time with you. And thanks to Jocelyn for co-hosting with us, and thanks to Calla, who is left, but she was wonderful. So thanks everybody for coming tonight, and we hope to see you in the next session.
Thanks so much, Caro. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Great work.
All right, more to
Bye.
come.
Good night.
Keep it up.